welcome back. Today we're going to be learning about something new. We're going to be learning about cellular respiration. So this is probably your first stop, learning about cellular respiration. Sometimes we like to teach cellular respiration and photosynthesis at the same time, like in the same unit. And other times you learn about cellular respiration with the human body and anatomy. So we're going to start by drawing, because why not, right? Okay, so first we're going to draw a mitochondria, because cellular respiration has to do with the mitochondria. So let's see if I can get us where we need to be. All right, so the mitochondria just kind of looks like a bean of some kind. And some of you will say, well, when you draw the chloroplast, then you'll notice that they also look like a bean. And so it's like, is that like related? Is it not? Absolutely. So thanks to something called the endosymbiotic theory, which I'll probably talk about a different day, chloroplasts and mitochondria used to be bacteria. And so they became engulfed. They have their own DNA. They have their own bacterial type ribosomes in themselves. They have all these things that are very much like a bacteria because they once were bacteria. So yes, it is not uncommon that they look alike. Those are very much related. So good idea. All right, so this is a mitochondria. So let's start labeling that. So up here, I'm going to write at the top of the page, I'm going to say mitochondria. All right, so now we know what organelle that we are dealing with. Something else that might be helpful is to talk about cellular respiration and what is it, where does it start, what's the process. So we're going to zoom in, see if I can do that so I don't overwhelm you. Let me zoom in a little more. Okay, so here we are, we're outside of the mitochondria in your cytoplasm. So remember, in a cell, right, you have a nucleus, which is the big organelle in the middle that holds your DNA. And then you have, mitochondria free floating around. Keep in mind, all these things that are free floating in here are floating in something, right? Your cells are mostly made of water. So what is that water? Is it the water that's in your sink? Is it different? So what it does is it forms kind of like a gel, like a very liquidy gel. And that gel is called cytoplasm. And it has all kinds of enzymes and cool things in it. So that's where we're talking about right now. So out here in the cytoplasm, you do step one. So let's just make a little note out here. All right, step one. And step one's name is glycolysis. Oops. Now, excuse me. When we talk about glycolysis, sometimes it's really helpful to break words apart. And I think this is a prime example of that. So if we go up here and we take glyco, like that, what does glyco mean? Glyco, like glycogen, and all of that is a place where we store sugar. It's a way to store sugar. And so this just lets you know sugar. And particularly, what type of sugar are we talking about? We're talking about glucose. And so that makes a lot of sense, right? Glyco, glucose, you can see that. Okay, and then when we talk about lysis, some of you have come across the prefix or the word lysis before. It's not the lice that's in your hair. A lot of times kids will say, is it like the lice, like the bugs? Is this about a bug? And I'm like, no. It's not about a bug. Lysis is spelled differently. And what that means is to burst or to break. So to break. And so even without studying, right, even without ever hearing the word glycolysis before, if you can break it into stem words or root words or prefixes or suffixes, you can already know what's going to happen. So what's going to happen is we're going to take glucose and we're going to break it. And that's all glycolysis is. So it's awesome. It's very simple in that way. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with that then. So I'm going to pick purple because I can. All right, so down here, we're going to have glucose. So that's C6H12. O6. So that's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. Okay? And so what's going to happen is in glycolysis, these are broken into pieces, 2 pieces. And so the way I like to think of it is if you took like a Twix bar and you broke it in half and you each got a half of a Twix bar. Kind of think of it like that, but on a chemical level. Okay, so the way I like to write it just to help me remember is it's C3H6O3. I like to just break it in half that way. So C3H6O3, and that's called pyruvate. Pyruvate. Okay, and sometimes when something ends in ATE, they will also refer to it as that acid. So like pyruvic acid and pyruvate are the same things. Lactate and lactic acid are the same substances. And so a lot of people get confused about that. And they're like, but my teacher said pyruvic acid. Is this the same thing? It is. So pyruvate, okay, or pyruvic acid. That way we don't get confused at all. There we go. Same thing over here, right? Or pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid, ACID. Okay, so that's the process. So now when you do this, you release a little bit of energy. And so we refer to energy used by mitochondria as ATP. So let me see if I can do that down here in a way where you can read it. So this process, the whole thing gives you plus 2 ATP. Okay. Now, some of you may remember ATP and it might be new to others. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. What that means is it's an adenine plus some other molecules, and then you've got 3 phosphates at the end. And what that whole substance does for your body is it energizes it. You use ATP like you would a fully charged battery, for instance. And so I get asked a lot, is 2 ATP a lot or is 2 ATP just a little? Because you always want to know scale, right? Like how much is a lot and how much is not a lot? Can I survive on 2 ATP? The answer is 2 ATP is not very much at all. It's very, very little. And so things that can survive on just 2 ATP would be like anaerobic bacteria. So these little single-celled microbes can survive on 2 ATP. But if you're a multicellular organism, you cannot really survive on 2 ATP. It takes so much energy just by being alive. Every time you digest food, you use ATP. Every time your lungs are moving to breathe for you, you use ATP. Every time chemical signals are being sent and your brain is having to process stuff that takes energy, that's ATP. All parts of digestion, like you think just the swallowing part, moving of the muscles there would take ATP, but even like the chemicals, so this is the mechanical digestion, even the chemical digestion that continues on, all of this requires energy from your body. And so you have like this energy debt, if you will, for all these processes growing. That takes ATP. Oh, there's our bell. Anyway, so ATP, you require a lot as a person. Animals require a ton of ATP. Plants require a lot of ATP. Think about how much ATP photosynthesis must use. And so when we think about 2 ATP, think of it like, one very minuscule touch of a tiny battery. Like if you plug in your phone for 2 seconds and then immediately unplug it from the wall, how much charge is your phone going to really hold in that 2 seconds? Well, it'll give you a little charge, but probably not long enough to actually use your phone. And in that way, 2 ATP is like that. It'll give you a little charge, but it's not enough to actually function as an organism that is larger than just one cell. All right, so some things to note. Step 1 glycolysis, we have broken apart sugar, right? So here's our glucose. We broke it into pyruvate or pyruvic acid, and that whole thing released ATP. Now, why did it release ATP? When you break bonds, think about almost like a glow stick. When you crack or snap it, when you break these bonds, what comes out is energy. And you can see that in a glow stick, right? When you crack it, it mixes these chemicals together and releases energy, light energy in a glow stick. And this one, we're getting some chemical energy, which is great. And you're getting 2 ATP, and that's that energy that's being released. Okay, Another quick note that you might want to write somewhere on your page or somewhere on your notes while you're listening to this is that this happens in the cytoplasm. So let me get a color here. I'll do green for right now. So make this a little smaller so it's not all there. All right, so this is in the cytoplasm. Remember, cytoplasm is just that jelly of the cell. And this, so glycolysis can happen in aerobic cellular respiration or anaerobic cellular respiration. And we'll get into the differences in a different video. But what we're talking about right now is aerobic cellular respiration. And so what happens in aerobic cellular respiration, which means when oxygen is present, is after step 1 here for glycolysis, you enter the mitochondria. So let's go ahead and jump over here. All right. So if you're looking right here, this is step 2, Krebs cycle. And all of these cycles are usually named after the people who discovered them. So if you're curious why they have, weird names, like the Calvin cycle in photosynthesis is named after Dr. Calvin. Krebs is no different. It's named after Dr. Krebs. So anyway, we're going to talk about step 2 now. So what happens in the Krebs cycle anyway? Well, first it helps if you remember that you have to start with the pyruvate. So if we go back over here where our pyruvate is right there, I like to draw a little line to help me remember where things are going and where they're coming from and all of that. So I'll pick purple so it matches. Okay, so I'm going to draw an arrow and that'll help you follow along. So I take that pyruvate right there and I draw myself a little arrow like this so that I understand why I'm starting with pyruvate in the Krebs cycle and it's not random, like it came from glycolysis. Okay, so here we go. So we start with pyruvate. So the first thing I like to do is write down pyruvate again over here to help me stay on track. And remember that you have 2 of those molecules, right? So there's 2 of those. They both are only half, which is why you don't write it like glucose because that's a much bigger molecule. But just please remember you have 2 of them. Okay, so what happens now? Well, let's think about what it means to respirate or respire, right? Right? So what's going to happen there? Well, if you notice when you were little or even now, when you go outside and it's really cold and you're like, look, I can see my breath, and you go, and then what you see is this cloud, right? So what that cloud is, and this is kind of gross, is your spit. And so I know that's so gross, but it's your spit. And so what you're seeing is, 1, you've blown out carbon dioxide, right? Because you inhale oxygen, you can oxygen to your bloodstream, but then you already have that old oxygen and that carbon in your bloodstream needing to get out. And so you exhale. When you exhale, you're exhaling through your mouth or through your nose. Either way, it's a moist environment where water is present, either in the form of snot or in the form of spit. And so you always have water vapor present. So when you think about exhaling, what is something that you are clearly going to do? Well, you're going to be losing carbon dioxide and you're going to be losing water. So this is the place where carbon dioxide exits the system. And so the way that I like to draw this is to draw, because it's called a cycle, I always like to draw that as a circle. So you draw like that, and then you have arrows. Let me try to get a new one up here. Okay, so on arrows, it tells you which way that the cycle is going. So in this case, the cycle goes this way. And so it helps you know which way the arrows are flowing. And so it's twisting like this. Okay, so now what comes out of that pyruvate? Well, that's going to be that CO2. And so CO2 is exiting your system. And so it comes down here is carbon dioxide. Let's write that here. CO2. And so where did that CO2 come from? Well, if you look up here at the pyruvate that you originally took in, you can see that it has C's and O's. Now with CO2, this is not a balanced equation because you can make far more than one CO2 molecule from pyruvate. I mean, look, you've got 3 C's right there and 3 O's right there, and then you've got 2 of those molecules. So really you have 6 carbons and 6 oxygens. I mean, technically speaking, you could make at least 3 of these with just one set of pyruvate, right? So it's not balanced. We can do that later if you want, but you can see that some of the carbon is leaving and some of the oxygen is leaving, but nothing is happening to that hydrogen. So what is going on with hydrogen? Well, before we can learn about that, we need to talk about our friend ATP. So once again, we have broken these bonds. We ripped apart those C's, H's, and O's. We snapped the bonds, right? So you can imagine it like a glue stick. So between the C and the H, or a glow stick. You snap between the C and the H, you snap between the H and the O, right? You break those chemical bonds. And when you're breaking bonds, which we did, it releases energy. So we've learned that already, right? So how much energy is created with CO2 production? It is plus 2 ATP. Okay, so now we're up to 4 total in aerobic cellular respiration. And as we know, 2 ATP is not a lot. So is 4 a lot? No, 4 is not a lot at all. This is just like plugging your phone in for a couple seconds, pulling it out, plugging it back in for 2 more seconds, unplugging it. Do you have more energy than you did just plugging it in once for 2 seconds? For sure, 4 seconds is twice as long. Is it enough for your phone to actually work? No, and it's not enough for you to work as a multicellular organism either. All right, so then what do? Well, let me change my colors here. We travel. And so now we go over here and we start a new process. So here we are over here. And this is step 3, and it's our final step. So there's only 3 steps. We like that. That makes life easy. So step 3 is the electron. Let me fix my box here. Transport chain. And so that name gives you some indications about what's going to happen, right? Obviously, electrons are involved. Clearly, things are going to be transported, and it's going to be a chain of reactions or a chain of events, right? So that's nice when they name stuff and it actually makes sense, which we know in life doesn't always happen. Okay, so now we're going back to drawing. As we've practiced before, you inhaled, right? Well, you took in that oxygen. So that oxygen has to be represented in this equation somewhere. So let's use green for now. Okay, so up here is where you've got that O2, right? You inhaled. We breathe all the time. So that's where that oxygen is coming into play into cellular respiration. That's why it's called aerobic cellular respiration, is because aerobic, that AER prefix, it sounds a lot like air, right? Aerobic, air. That makes sense. Even though it's not spelled like air, the prefix still means air. Think of an old school way to spell aeroplane, right? They used to spell that A-E-R-O, or aerodynamic, things like that. So needless to say, aerodynamic has to do with the flow of oxygen, the flow of air. So this is where our oxygen is flowing into the system because you inhaled. Okay, so now here we are in the electron transport chain. The way I like to draw the electron transport chain is as a staircase. The reason I like to do that is because the way that these events happen works much like a staircase does. There's a short burst and then a downfall, and then a short burst and then a shuttle, and a short burst and a shuttle. And so I like to draw it as a staircase. Sometimes they call it like a waterfall effect, and it's falling down, down, down. Okay, so we've taken in oxygen, right? And we know that this hydrogen is getting passed over. So let's make sure that we're showing that that's getting passed over. So all those H's are coming on over. So H gets shoved over there. All right. And you are breathing in oxygen, right? So as we continue, and once again, it's not a balanced equation, so be patient with me. What happens is those H's, those little electrons, go to the top of the staircase. I don't know if you've ever had a slinky, like the slinkies that they're metal or plastic. And if you've ever tossed one down a staircase, right, they land and then the back end flips over the top end and like that. This is exactly what happens to hydrogen. Now, we've taken in oxygen, so where does it go? Where's its place? Oxygen patiently waits for hydrogen at the bottom of the stairs, right? So there's oxygen down there. So it's waiting to catch its friend. Now, hydrogen you can sort of think of as like a clumsy situation. And so what happens is this hydrogen falls down the stairs and falls down the stairs and falls and falls and falls until it lands on that oxygen. Now, what happens when it lands on the oxygen? Well, it creates a chemical byproduct from the electron transport chain, and that chemical byproduct is H2O. And so I will color code that for you. And what is H2O? As everyone knows, H2O is water. And so when we talked about, and you could see your breath because it was cold outside, what you were seeing was your spit. So what you were seeing is the water in your spit form a cloud, in the cold right above you because those water crystals were freezing. So that's why part of respiring, part of respirating, part of breathing has to do with giving out water. Now, when I talk about that, this is all happening in your mitochondria. We're not talking about large scale out of your mouth per se. Oh, there's our bell again. But what we are talking about is basically that same process of breathing in and breathing out happening for the mitochondria as it's happening large scale for you, because where it's getting all of these products, the reason that when you exhale carbon dioxide and you exhale water is because of your mitochondria and because all of these things are happening. We don't often think like, oh, I breathe in and I breathe out. Yes, this must be happening on an organelle level. Like nobody talks like that. Like nobody thinks about it. But it is. The reason that you are getting to exhale these things is because of all of this action. And that's kind of neat. Okay, so now, is that all that occurs? No, because we have to talk about our friend ATP. So every time that this hydrogen lands on a staircase or falls down the stairs, it releases massive amounts of ATP, right? Every time, like whoosh, ATP. And so how many stairs are there? How much does it release? Most people, and there's some debate on this, but for the most part, the agreed upon number is plus 32 ATP. Now, this is where my kids say, Ms. Engel, is that a lot? And I say, yes, that is a lot. So this is where you can become, a great complex organism. And so you get like a big bang for your buck at the end. The electron transport chain, the whole reason it's like super important is because it gives you the most ATP. It gives you that ATP that can make you grow into a very complex molecule. It gives you that ATP so that you can digest big molecules of food. And without it, we would be very, very small, like a single-celled bacteria. But because of it, whoosh, now our possibilities are just much, much larger, right? Things to think about. You require so much ATP. Think about whales or sharks or things that have to swim all the time to keep breathing, to keep alive, right? Whales don't have to swim all the time to necessarily breathe because they're mammals. They breathe oxygen from the surface. But sharks are fish. And so they have to have oxygen dissolved in the water going over their gills all the time or they will suffocate. And I find this to be amazing. How many calories must they burn every day? How many must they find to take in? How much ATP are they using just by being alive? And it is so much. And then you think about land mammals and elephants, and you're like, oh my goodness, you're huge. It must take a ton of ATP to get to move your body through a space. Anyway, so it's crazy. There's all of this stuff that starts firing off in your head once you understand what ATP actually does for you. Okay, so let me zoom out a little bit. There we go. All right, so I've drawn all of this. Now it's at the end of aerobic respiration. So how much ATP have we actually made? So the grand total ATP per 1 molecule of glucose. Okay, so that's what that number means, is what's our total? Well, if you add up 2 from glycolysis, so 2 from glycolysis, and then 2 from Krebs, and then 32 from what we call the ETC, or the electron transport chain. Our grand total is 36 ATP. And don't forget to put your units on there. That matters. That's 36 molecules of ATP. And that's huge. And I mean, honestly, you got all of that energy from 1 molecule of glucose. 1. I can't even tell you how many molecules of glucose are in like a piece of bread, or even a smaller scale, like an apple. Like, it's exponential, So like, we're thinking about, okay, well, how much is 1 molecule of glucose? Well, it's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. That's not really something you can conceptually like see. But you can see an apple and think, wow, how many ATP must an apple give me, right? And so there's foods that help supply energy for you. Those foods are called carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are made of simple sugars, and glucose is the monomer, or a monosaccharide. It is one of the most common simple sugars that make up life. And so in this case, glucose is also your blood sugar, and so it's very important for you. Okay, so the only thing I want to add, just to conclude our notes on this for the day, is that this is the total for aerobic cellular respiration. Okay, and that concludes our notes on aerobic cellular respiration today. Next time we will pick up with anaerobic cellular respiration, and how does that work anyway. See you next time.